Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to explore a really fascinating transformation in Japan's business world. That legendary post-war model that brought them so much success, how it's evolved into something entirely new. We've got some great excerpts here from Ulrike Schaade's Choose and Focus to help guide us. So what kind of journey are we embarking on today?
It's going to be a captivating one, for sure. We're going to delve into Japan's economic evolution, and we'll uncover how forces like deregulation, globalization, and just the strategies companies are using, have completely reshaped industries, business practices, even employment trends. And we're going to look at real-world examples of companies and industries adapting in remarkable ways.
Okay, so Japan's post-war economic miracle is pretty well known. Where do we even begin to unpack this shift?
Well, let's imagine a system built on diversification. These intricate networks called keiretsu, and those strong ties with the main banks, right? So companies, they weren't just in one business, they were in many, often bound by cross-shareholdings, kind of owning parts of each other. And the main bank wasn't just some lender, it was like a guardian, offering financial support, guidance, even stepping in to rescue a struggling company.
Very different from the competitive free market model we often see today. But we can't forget about lifetime employment, right?
Right. Employees expected to stay with the same company throughout their entire careers. It bred unwavering loyalty on both sides. Companies invested heavily in their workforce's training. And the employees, they dedicated themselves to the company's success. It was a system that worked, for a while at least.
Diversification, cross-shareholdings, main banks, lifetime employment. The recipe for Japan's economic dominance. But then Schaede calls this a period of strategic inflection, a turning point. What were the vulnerabilities that led to this?
Well, you see, stability can sometimes lead to rigidity, right?
Yeah.
So companies nestled in this really supportive web, they weren't always motivated to take those big risks or really prioritize innovation. The focus was more on maintaining harmony and market share. There's this interesting story about Mazda's crisis back in the 1970s. Instead of letting them falter, the Sumitomo Group, they rallied around Mazda, encouraging even their own employees to buy Mazda cars. It shows the loyalty and interconnectedness of that era.
A level of commitment we rarely see today. But of course, the world was changing. What specific factors forced Japan to really confront this strategic inflection point?
So picture it, the late 1990s. Japan is grappling with these social and economic crises, a banking crisis is unfolding, and a powerful China is entering the global stage. The pressure for legal reform was mounting as well, transparency and accountability becoming increasingly important in this globalized economy.
Quite a convergence of challenges to the status quo. So how does a nation so rooted in stability even begin to adapt? That's where Choose and Focus comes into play, right? It seems like the opposite of everything we've discussed so far.
Choose and Focus represented a pretty radical departure. Companies were urged to shed those underperforming businesses, streamline their operations, and sharpen their competitive edge by concentrating on their core strengths.
Not just theory, but action. Companies like Matsushita, which we know as Panasonic, they provide a good example. They were involved in everything from electronics to household appliances. How did they manage this shift?
Matsushita underwent this dramatic restructuring. They divested businesses, cut costs, and poured resources into research and development, focusing on advanced technologies. They transformed from this sprawling giant into this focused tech leader. They became major players in plasma TVs and mobile phone tech, for example.
A bold move, given their history. Did this Choose and Focus mentality spread across the business world?
It resonated with many Japanese companies. They realized that agility, efficiency, and innovation were crucial in this globalized economy. But this transformation wasn't limited to individual companies. It really shook the foundation of those powerful keiretsu, those intricate networks we discussed.
We talked about loyalty and interconnectedness, but the keiretsu were bound by those cross-shareholdings. Did that start to unravel?
In a big way, banks began selling off their equity stakes. And companies, they started forming these new alliances, sometimes even across those traditional group boundaries. Imagine those bright lines connecting the keiretsu on a map, and they begin to fade, and new connections emerge. It was a signal that Japan was becoming less insular, more open to those fresh possibilities.
It paints a picture of a system in flux. And that must have created a power vacuum. Who stepped into that space?
Well, it was foreign investors. They sensed an opportunity in this evolving market and weren't afraid to shake things up. They pushed for higher returns and demanded greater transparency. And this, in turn, spurred a corporate governance revolution.
So a revolution sparked by internal and external pressures. Was this foreign influence a net positive, a net negative, or somewhere in between?
Well, that's a really complex question. No simple answer. On one hand, it did push companies to become more efficient and focus on shareholder value. But on the other hand, it did disrupt long-standing relationships and contributed to job losses.
The classic dilemma, right? Balancing progress with tradition. It seems this shift impacted everything from those subcontracting relationships to the lives of everyday consumers. But we'll have to save that for part 2 of this deep dive. We'll pick up right where we left off with a closer look at how these transformations played out in different sectors of the Japanese economy.
We've been talking about those big corporate players, but let's look at the intricate web of subcontracting relationships that really powered Japan's manufacturing success. You know, in that older system, it was all about loyalty and long-term partnerships. Those big manufacturers cultivated these networks of suppliers, often through exclusive agreements.
It sounds very different from the competitive global supply chains we see now.
Yeah.
How did this system adapt to Japan's transformation?
Well, as competition on a global scale heated up, these relationships underwent a major shift. The emphasis moved from, those lasting partnerships to a more transactional model driven by price. It became less about close ties and more about finding the best deal.
So a move toward a more global procurement strategy, was that the case across all industries, or were there exceptions?
Take the automotive industry. It's a great example. Car manufacturers still relied heavily on subcontractors for parts, but they started sourcing those lower-value components through open bidding. It was all about getting the lowest price. But for the more high-value parts, especially those involving cutting-edge technology, collaboration remained crucial.
So a more nuanced approach, balancing costs with strategic partnerships. Did this move towards price-based competition contribute to what some call the hollowing out of Japan's manufacturing sector? Companies moving production overseas.
It certainly did play a role. As companies focused on cutting costs, many of them moved production to countries with lower labor costs. And that had a big impact on Japan's economy and workforce. The government faced this really tough challenge, balancing, addressing rising unemployment and social unrest, while also encouraging businesses to stay competitive.
A tough balancing act, for sure. And this deep dive really highlights how these economic shifts affected all levels of Japanese society. Not just companies, but also everyday people.
Yeah.
We've talked about globalization and competition. But Schaede also points out the decline of this practice called atojime. Can you explain what that was?
Well, imagine a system where prices aren't set in stone, but are adjusted after a sale. That's atojime. It was meant to spread risk and stabilize prices in a fluctuating market. Another example of the mutual support that was so central to Japan's traditional business world.
Sounds incredibly complex. Almost counterintuitive to how we think about pricing today.
Yeah.
How did atojime actually work?
Let's say two companies agree on a price for a product. After the sale, they might renegotiate that price based on things like changes in material costs or market demand. It was a way to share the burden, especially during tough economic times.
But as Japan embraced a more competitive, globalized model, atojime must have run into some major obstacles, right?
Exactly. You see, as companies started prioritizing their own profits and wanted more control over their pricing, atojime just became too difficult to maintain. The system depended on trust and a willingness to share burdens, which kind of eroded as competition intensified.
So, a casualty of these new economic realities. Is there a specific example that highlights the decline of atojime?
The vinyl wrap plastics industry provides a good case study. There was a cartel in this industry that tried for years to control prices using atojime. But eventually, they came under scrutiny and were reprimanded by the authorities. It was a clear signal that these types of practices just didn't fit in with the new emphasis on open competition.
It's incredible how this shift touched every part of Japan's business world. We've seen its effects on corporations, subcontractors, and even these pricing practices. But how did these changes impact the average consumer? Did this choose and focus lead to changes in their shopping habits?
Absolutely. Get ready for a retail revolution. Japan's shopping scene experienced a huge makeover as those large-scale retailers appeared. They offered a wider variety of products and more competitive prices. Those traditional small shops that used to be everywhere, they faced a big challenge.
It's a familiar story, I guess, those big box stores reshaping retail around the world. But Japan's tech-savvy population must have been pretty quick to embrace online shopping, right?
Oh, definitely. The rise of e-commerce gave consumers the power to shop from home, compare prices from tons of sellers. Platforms like Rakuten and Kakaku.com really took off. They provided these online marketplaces and sophisticated tools for comparing prices.
It wasn't just about replicating those physical stores online. They used technology to offer new features and improve the whole shopping experience.
Exactly. Companies like Rakuten, they understood that just being a platform for sellers wasn't enough. They had to incorporate things like product reviews, price comparisons, loyalty programs, cater to those increasingly informed and demanding shoppers.
This must have been a tough transition for companies used to doing things the traditional way in Japan.
You're right. Some struggled to adapt. They held on to those outdated practices and couldn't keep up with what shoppers wanted. But others, they embraced the changes and found ways to flourish. They understood the need to make the customer experience better, to streamline their operations, and use technology to their advantage.
A real testament to the resilience and adaptability of Japanese businesses. We've seen corporations transform, supply chains restructure, and the retail sector undergo this complete upheaval. But what about that famous lifetime employment system? Could a practice so deeply ingrained withstand these powerful forces? So we've really dug deep into Japan's remarkable journey, from their post-war model to this new era of competition and innovation. But there's one last piece to examine. What happened to that famous lifetime employment system? It feels kind of contradictory to all this dynamism we've been discussing.
You're right. Lifetime employment, it was a pillar of Japan's post-war success. But it came under immense pressure as the business landscape shifted. Could such a system truly survive in a world demanding constant change?
So did companies just ditch it completely, or did it evolve in some way?
More of an evolution, really. Companies still saw the value in their experienced workforce. They weren't eager to just sever those long-standing ties, but they also knew they had to adapt.
How did lifetime employment reconcile with the demands of this changing economy?
Well, there were legal reforms that allowed businesses to let go of employees under certain conditions, and performance-based pay started to gain traction. The idea of staying with one company your whole career, it shifted from this absolute guarantee to more of a long-term commitment, but one that depended on performance and the changing needs of the business.
A subtle but significant shift.
Right.
What impact did this have on, the mindsets of both employers and employees?
It became less about just loyalty and more about specialized skills, and staying competitive in a rapidly changing job market. Employees couldn't just rely on seniority anymore. They had to develop a wider range of skills and show their value.
Fascinating. So lifetime employment didn't just vanish. It adapted, reflecting the new era. It's a great example of how even those deeply rooted practices can change with the times.
Absolutely. And it raises an interesting question. What's the right balance between stability and flexibility in employment models? It's something to consider not just in Japan, but in workplaces everywhere as the way we work continues to evolve.
A question worth pondering for sure. As we approach the final chapter of Japan's business transformation, we see this intriguing development, the rise of venture capital. It seems like an unlikely fit for a nation known for its conservative approach to business.
At first, venture capital struggled to take root in Japan. Those structures we discussed earlier, the keiretsu, those close relationships with main banks, they provided a safety net for established businesses, which made it hard for startups to get funding and compete.
So how did venture capital and Japan's traditional business culture eventually find common ground? What led to its acceptance?
As Japan's economy changed, those traditional barriers began to crumble, and those new technologies, especially the internet, created opportunities that demanded a different approach. There was this growing sense that nurturing innovation was essential if Japan wanted to remain competitive globally.
So internal pressures and external possibilities coming together. Any particular examples that illustrate this shift?
The story of SoftBank and its founder, Masayoshi Son, is a perfect example. Son, he started as a software distributor, but he quickly saw the potential of the internet and made these bold investments in companies like Yahoo and Alibaba, and those paid off big time.
I bet those successes gave him the capital and influence to challenge the status quo in Japan.
He did. He used that success to disrupt the telecommunications industry, taking on the giant NTT SoftBank. They went after customers aggressively, offering competitive prices, free modems, and using these innovative marketing strategies. They knew to gain market share, they had to offer something different and something better than what was already out there.
It's a classic David and Goliath story, but with this modern twist. It's amazing how one company can be a catalyst for change.
SoftBank's success proved that venture capital could work in Japan. And it opened the door for a new wave of entrepreneurs and investors. Venture capital firms started popping up everywhere, supporting startups in all sorts of fields, from biotech to e-commerce.
It seems like Japan's entrepreneurial spirit was finally set free, embracing this new path for growth and innovation. We've covered a lot of ground today, from stability and tradition to dynamism and competition. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you want our listeners to remember?
Japan's story shows us that even the most successful systems have to adapt, choose, and focus, and embracing competition and innovation. These have become the guiding principles for thriving in this globalized economy.
That's spot on. And for our listeners, as you continue to learn about Japan's economy, keep in mind that change is a constant. The path from stability to adaptability, it's ongoing. It holds valuable lessons for everyone, not just in business, but in life as well.
Think about the implications of choose and focus in your own field. How can you balance stability with flexibility? How can you cultivate a culture of innovation? These are important things to think about in this ever-changing world.
Excellent food for thought. Thank you for joining us on this fascinating exploration of Japan's incredible transformation. Until next time.